Okay, thanks very much for giving your time again, Mike. In this series of talks for Hopi, we want to address various aspects of the development of the protest movement in Iran, but inevitably we also have to consider what's happening with the left in Iran. And one of my concerns, and it is shared by some comrades, not everyone, is the fears that the Iranian left is increasingly becoming what I would call bourgeois liberal, pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-US, pro-imperialist. And this isn't accidental. I think aspects of it are to do with Iran's politics, the fact that after the revolution, quite a lot of these groups did support the Islamic Republic on the basis of supporting the Soviet Union. And there have been defeats and so on. But I think the this recent turn to the right is also rooted in what the Iranian left reads from US and UK international journals, international magazines, and so on. I emphasize these two because inside Iran, most people wouldn't necessarily speak French or Spanish or other languages. So that's why I emphasize English. And here, it would be good to understand how we've reached this stage where there are people who consider themselves on the left and can support NATO or can support US imperialism, and the lessons we can learn from maybe the mistakes of the international left in that respect. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Yasmin, for inviting me to talk about this. I'm going to say something, I guess, fairly superficial. I begin with what have the effects of the United States' overseas interventions been since 1975? I say 1975 because 1975 was the moment to which the United States was run out of Saigon in a humiliating way and elected the turn in policy. I think the turn in policy had in some respects begun before 1975, but the turn in policy became overt with the United States being run out of Saigon and also with the Portuguese Revolution of 1974-76. And the United States turned at this moment to deploying US diplomatic, financial, and special forces assistance to various sorts of guerrilla forces aimed against third world nationalist movements. So we start with US backing for and South African backing for the UNITA movement in Angola, aimed to neuter the fact that Angola had obtained independence as a result of the Portuguese Revolution. And there was a very similar operation run out of South Africa, basically funded by the United States, directed against Mozambique. At the same period, the outbreak of the Lebanese civil war was initiated by the Maronites, but with US and Israeli backing. The Phalange, the party at the far right, but with US and Israeli covert backing, followed up by Israeli direct military intervention, United States direct military intervention, which they got run out of Beirut in '82, which gave rise to a US, we should call this a grievance, a grudge, which is a grudge both towards Iran and a grudge towards Lebanon. And the upshot of this is that Lebanon, which was before the initiation of the Maronite, Israeli-backed Maronite civil war operation, was one of the wealthiest countries in the Middle East, has been reduced to paralyzed state, militia control of different areas, and government totally mired in corruption, unable to do anything successfully. The US backed the opposition to because the Somalian regime of General Siad Barre played footsie with the Soviet Union. The US backed an opposition to Siad Barre, which issued in the failure of Somalia as a state and the reduction of the country to extraordinarily localized warlordism. So these are early examples. I said the US backed the Khmer Rouge against the as a terrorist formation against the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia. And again, the effect is simply massive impoverishment of Cambodia relative to what went before. As soon as the Saur Revolution in Afghanistan took place, the US began to back what became later called the Mujahideen, initially with financial aid run through Pakistani ISI and from 1979. So before the, quote, Soviet invasion, the United States started supplying arms to the Mujahideen. Against the Nicaraguan revolution, the US conducted the extraordinary Iran-Contra operation, whereby the US, in alliance with the State of Israel and the Islamic Republic, organized complex set of trading relationships which supplied arms to the Nicaraguan Contra insurgents, which Congress hadn't approved, paid for by the supply of cocaine on large scale into US cities, which in turn was a whole complex system of being brokered through. I'm not quite sure how the deals were worked out with the Iranian Islamic Republic. There is good reason to suppose that the United States suggested to Saddam Hussein al-Tikriti that after he took power, that he should launch the Iran-Iraq war, and it's certainly the case a few years later that the United States took direct military intervention against Iran. The level of destruction of that war, again, you're talking about destruction and impoverishment. The first Gulf War and the system of sanctions which was left in place all through it's not the first Gulf War, the first US-Iraq war in 1990-91, and the system of sanctions which was left in place all through the 1990s, massive impoverishment of Iraq, and then, of course, in the invasion of 2003. What have we got out of the invasion of 2003? I flag again like Lebanon, a paralyzed and half-broken state, a massive impoverishment, very substantial deindustrialization, weakening of infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And for all the pretenses of creating democracy, 31st of May 2004, Lawrence Friedman writes in the Financial Times, quote, "The British are determined to draw in the Iranians as a potentially calming influence on the Shia Muslim population in southern Iraq. American objections, quite strong in the past, are growing fainter. And the reality is this is the regime which has been created, all the efforts to create a, quote, democratizing, unquote, regime went nowhere. What we wound up with is a regime which is an unstable bloc of parties dependent on the Iranian Islamic Republic, together with the Kurds in a semi-autonomous state. But of course, the United States, the Kurds have great hopes of the United States and of Israel as backing their demands for Kurdish self-determination and perhaps even for a greater Kurdistan. But the reality is that the United States' alliance with Turkey is, at the end of the day, rather more important to the United States than the alliance with the Kurds. The Kurds are useful idiots, and were useful idiots in the United States deploying them against Iraq, in the United States deploying them against the Ba'athist regime in Syria. In Syria, too, the United States intervention has not created democracy, but merely ruin and paralysis. And suppose we imagine an actual victory of the United States and the Russians, which if the United States succeeds in its effort to conquer Russia in the Ukraine war, and the Putin administration is overthrown, Russia is deindustrialized, and the Russian arms industry struck down, then the Russians will be pulled out of Syria. But what will you get under US control? You will get something like Libya, which again we have state failure, militias controlling and in conflict with one another, massive destruction, and so on and so on. So I'm not going to say very much more on that, but there are a number of other examples which could be given. In a sense, former Yugoslavia is another example, now under a series of United Nations, US/UN protectorates. The science fiction writer Ken MacLeod imagined at one stage a future in which Britain was subject to US-UN intervention, and London was divided up into 15 different sectarian enclaves under the aegis of United Nations intervention forces. It's very easy. It's very easy to imagine, because this is what the actual product is. Okay, so why? And the illusion that imperialist intervention could create stability and modernization is an illusion which is derived from the nature of the Dutch and subsequent British empires in the 18th and 19th centuries. And even in the relative decline of the British Empire in the second half of the 19th century, although the British Empire was barbaric, Karl Marx commented that the empire was one which employed torture as an instrument of tax policy. And although it was an institution which destroyed the Indian cotton industry for the sake of the British cotton industry, nonetheless, it did actually succeed in creating railway infrastructure and industrial capabilities in India, and a degree of order. There's a chapter in Jonathan Parry's book Promised Lands about the British policy towards the Ottomans in the early 19th century, which describes the British as being characterized by a passion for order, which led them to support Mehmed Ali's regime in Egypt until the man got too big for his boots and the British intervened against him. But it is genuinely the case that there was an increase in public order, which is reflected, is a general increase in public order, which is the creation of capitalism more generally, that when we compare capitalist regimes to pre-capitalist regimes, there is less banditry, there is less general extortion by local officials, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, why doesn't the United States do that? The United States is today like Britain in the later 19th century, in relative decline. Relative decline doesn't mean that the United States is in absolute decline. It means that the United States, being the world hegemon, has in consequence the ultimate reserve currency. And the consequence of its having the ultimate reserve currency is that people who are seeking stable investments, safe investments, invest in the United States. whereas people in the United States who are seeking higher return investments invest outside the United States. And the effect of the people seeking the flow of hot money into the United States, just as was the case in the Netherlands in the 1700s and in England in the later 1800s, drives land prices up. By driving land prices up, it drives rents up. By driving rents up, it drives wages up. Without wages go up relative to profits, without the position of the working class dramatically improving because the money's going into rents. But the fact that wages and rents are driven up drives productive investment overseas. And in Britain, the productive investment went into the United States, it went into Germany, it went to various, to some extent, mainly to the white colonies rather than to India, but it did go to India to some extent. But in the United States, it's gone to a variety of places. It went to Latin America and the Middle East in the 1950s and 60s. Then after 75, that's pulled and it moves to Southeast Asia and East Asia and the, quote, Asian tigers, which in reality, all that's happened is that the radical growth of East Asia corresponds to the partial deindustrialization of Latin America and the Middle East and of the United States itself. Okay, so that decline then means that in the industrial proponent, the United States remains dominant militarily and financially, but industrially it's less dominant. And how is the United States to respond to that? Now, the response of both the Netherlands and Britain to that phenomenon was to tie the colonial territories to the home territory, primarily by using what are called non-tariff barriers, the regulatory measures of one sort and another, which pushed the colonial territories into trade primarily with the metropolis. In India, a substantial part of that was the device whereby the Indians were supposed to pay for the army which held them down. And then that became how do we pay? We have to pay the British, and in order to pay the British, we have to export primary raw materials to the British. And that's it. And the tie also involves that we buy British and we don't buy, in industry, we buy British and we don't buy German. And it's that policy of the British government of tying the colonies to itself by and the semi-colonies in Latin America as well, which were subordinate to Britain until 1914, through non-tariff barriers and indirect trade controls, that drove the enormous expansion of European territorial empires, because everybody else needed to do the same thing in the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. Why doesn't the United States do that? And the answer, I think, is that the decline of the United States takes place in the context of the decline of capitalism as such. And the form of the decline of capitalism, is the way in which the decline of capitalism as such affects it, is that the growth of the working class and of working class organization forces the core capitalist states to make major concessions to the working class in the form of Medicare in the United States, the NHS in the UK, social security arrangements both in the US and in the UK and in continental Europe, free public education, and so on, and indeed also in terms of wages and conditions and so on. The consequence of this is that during the 19th century, Britain was a major exporter of population. The dynamic of migration was of the Brits, because it was not so great to be a worker in Victorian Britain, or indeed to be a middle class person in Victorian Britain. One of my great-great-grandfathers went bust trying to farm in Ireland and emigrated to Australia and went bust there and became a journalist and politician. Another was a not terribly successful lawyer in England, but went to Calcutta and made a fortune at the Calcutta bar, and then came back to England and spent it all. Wales, I should say, came out Wales and spent it all. So this this outward drive, that it's the export of people. This export of people from Britain produces the cadre, the officers and NCOs of the colonial armies, though the colonial armies are largely raised in northern India. The British colonial armies are largely raised in northern India. It's guys from northern India who conquer Southeast Asia, parts of Southeast Asia and south of Africa for the British. But the officer corps and the colonial civil servants and the governor general's offices and all the stuff like that, this is produced by the emigration of people from the upper working class and the middle class. And the white colonies, similar, produced by this emigration. So the emigration, what enables the British, and it's also true of the French in the later 19th century, to export order, to create infrastructure, to create the conditions for investment which creates infrastructure in the colonial world, is the fact that the capitalism is still in the process of converting a large agricultural workforce into an industrial workforce. But when that process is completed, we get in France first and then in Britain not long after, and in the United States somewhat later than that, what's called the demographic transition, where people stop having so many children. And going along with that, the situation arises that there isn't a vast population pressure to export population, and major concessions have to be made to the working class. So the dynamic of migration moves. Britain is in balance as far as migration is concerned, immigration and emigration, very approximately until the late 20th century. France immigration becomes important, I think, proportionately somewhere in the 1960s. Yeah. But the cadre is not there for the imperialist powers to sustain permanent occupation forces, permanent controls and so on. That's already the case in relation to the United States empire at its height in the period 1945 to 1975. So that where the United States operates in 1945 to 75 is indirect interventions, coupled with support for local military regimes or local pseudo-traditionalist regimes like the Saudi regime or the Shah of Iran or the Jordanian monarchy or the various Gulf states. I say pseudo-traditionalist because how much of a history these dynasties have is pretty negligible. And then 75, attempting to impose order fails. The United States makes a major ideological turn, that instead of stability and material progress, what is on offer is rights, human rights, and quote, self-determination, so that we get promotion of secessionist movements. The United States promotes secessionist movements in a whole load of different places, as this can be a tactic. More recent, but a very recent example is the Bolivian left won election mainly based on votes from the highlands and with a significant Andean culture aspect to it. The lowlanders, who were in reality the latifundista agri-capitalists backed by the United States, launched a self-determination movement. In the end, it didn't. The upshot of it was backing off by the elected government. But this similarly, actually, the Yugoslav thing is all in the name of the breakup of Yugoslavia. It's all in the name of self-determination. So self-determination, human rights, but actually what lies under the doctrines of self-determination and human rights is deindustrialization in Latin America, in the first place, and in the Middle East. The sponsorship in the Middle East of Islamist trends through post the what's called the oil price shock. Funds got fed into Saudi and fed through Saudi into Wahhabi versions of Islam, up and down all across the world, Pakistan included, in place of Deobandism. We get Wahhabi versions sponsored by Saudi Arabia, but it's funded at the end of the day through the United States' military economic arrangements. The consequence, therefore, is the United States. We cannot in the least imagine in any return to the sort of imperialism which promotes order and development, because the underlying dynamics which cause it to be absent are caused by the dynamics of the decline of capitalism as they work on the decline of the United States. That the United States in decline cannot do the sort of imperialism that Britain and France did, and it can't do that sort of imperialism because capitalism is in decline relative to, I'm not saying capitalism is about to collapse. Capitalism is in decline relative to the late 19th century, and therefore the United States lacks the capability to impose order worldwide, and instead, in order to protect the American way of life, it simply exports destruction. Now we come to the social imperialists, and the social imperialists, there's a sort of there has been an element of social imperialism in the Western left for a long time. So the guys, Susie Weissman and guys like that in the States, it's not new that the Shachtman tendency, that the United States, the trend in the American left, which called itself third campist, should be inclined to prettify the operations of the United States in Eastern Europe and in the Third World. Similarly, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty in Britain has been since 1981 to a pro-imperialist advocate, anti-imperialist organization. What's changed is the sudden shift of the Fourth International, the main historic Trotskyist organization, and a load of people who are seriously influenced by that organization into social imperialism around Ukraine. Now, what I think is the process by which this has happened is, in the first place, that because the Fourth Internationalists fetishized street demonstrations, they are unable to distinguish between street demonstrations organized by progressives and street demonstrations organized by reactionaries. And in consequence of that, they are also unable to distinguish between a genuine mass movement and something which is got up, orchestrated, quote, a well-orchestrated swell of public outrage. unquote. And that is trigger is that 2014 starts with, in Kiev, starts with a demonstration of a size which the British Socialist Workers, a couple of thousand, of the size which the British Socialist Workers' Party could mobilise in London, and dominated by the far right. And then there's a false flag attack on that demonstration, done by the far right. The United States has admitted in documents that it was done by a false flag attack done by the far right on their own demonstration. But it isn't admitted in 2014 that that's the case. It's blamed on the police force. And that triggers an enormous mass mobilization, which ousts the government and puts in place a government explicitly chosen by the United States, not by anybody else. The Victoria Newland's correspondence and recorded conversations showed that this was just the choice of the United States. And that in turn leads to the new government immediately launches attacks on the Russian speakers in the south and east of the country, and that's but the Fourth Internationalists think of that as a genuine revolution, and then, having thought of that as a genuine revolution, now they think of what's happening in Ukraine as simply, this is about self-determination. But it's about self-determination in the same sense as the guys in this country, in the labor movement in this country in 1914-18 and elsewhere, who argued that the First World War was all about the self-determination of, quote, plucky little Belgium, brave little Belgium, plucky little Serbia, brave little Serbia, and about the self-determination of bleeding Belgium, terrible, overrun by invaders and so on and so forth. But in reality, what was going on was a conflict between the great powers for the redivision of the world. And when self-determination reappeared in Versailles in the end of the war, it was very clear that it had limits. It applied to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an enormous cost in suffering to the inhabitants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because that was to break up an existing economy along into 8 different territorial entities, each of which had to have its own customs, and destroy a customs union. And in Poland, the self-determination of Poland had the curious result. Yes, I'm sure that masses of people in Poland wanted self-determination, but it meant that you shut down the part of Polish industry which was tied to Germany and the part of Polish industry which was tied to Russia, and Poland became deindustrialized. So this delusion about self-determination, and the delusion equally that the West will bring democracy, parry again on promised lands. There is more than one episode in the first half of the 19th century where the British promised the Kurds British support for Kurdistan. How much truth was there in it? None. Everybody who places faith in perfidious Albion will be betrayed, and everybody who places faith in perfidious Washington will be betrayed. And from that point of view, the predominance of social imperialism at the present is enormously misleading to people it's dreadfully it's paralysis and turning organizations of the left into a tail end for the maneuvers of their own governments in Britain, the United States, France, the Netherlands, etc., Germany. But for people in the targeted countries like Iran or Syria or Iraq, this is like turkeys voting for an early Christmas, as the expression goes, or the bizarre poem of John Betjeman, "Come, friendly bombs, and fall on Slough." It's an illusion which leads to disaster. That's it.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to ask a couple of very short points so you can answer all of them in one go. I know you probably have very little time, but I'll try. First of all, before Ukraine, I think some of these social imperialists were supporting any opposition in Syria and any opposition in Libya. And the experience of both of those places, as you alluded to, hasn't really been human rights for anyone in those countries, but also you can't really talk of self-determination. So can they point to an example where there has been at least the appearance of human rights, improvements of human rights? I mean, I look at Iraq, Syria, Libya, Egypt, after Sisi, I can't see any. So am I mistaken, or is there something else? You talked about this trend, this destructive trend, which is quite obvious, and I think you drew the history very well. Can one say that there might be exceptions to it, or is this trend, especially since 75, has been so solid that we really can't envisage exceptions to it? And finally, part of the problem, as far as I can see, is that for sections of the left, yes, you are right, demonstrations are important, but there was always an illusion of another big power that would help them. And I think, for example, those who believe that the Soviet Union could be reformed with political revolutions, that it was a deformed worker state, as some of these social imperialists did believe, they had this other pole, this power that they could hope for. And it's in particular since the collapse of the Soviet Union that we see a shift. So instead of thinking, well, actually, this is good that there isn't a Soviet Union, we can think independently and organize independently, they seem to have gone for soft support for the other global power, the hegemon power. Is this too simplistic, or am I mistaken in this? That's it.
Okay. Number one, is there any examples of where there's an actual improvement in human rights, etc.? It's difficult to pin down. It's certainly the case that the fall of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe in 1989 to 91 produced for a period of time a significant degree of liberalization in relation to political liberties. And that continues to be the case in the Czech Republic. But the underlying trend is that in all of these countries, we can see in Poland, the Law and Justice Party is basically a far right Catholic clericalist. I won't say clerical fascist because I think fascist is quite problematic, but it's a far-right clericalist party, very close, like not at all dissimilar to the far-right clericalist parties of the pre-war period. In Hungary, Orbán started out as a liberal. Interestingly, the United States, the US and Europe massively supported Hungary in the first period of the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, and Hungary was lent vast sums of money. But then, as soon as the collapse was complete, and it looked as though with Yeltsin the East was safe, the loans were foreclosed. This is true of Hungary and true of Romania. Then even worse in Hungary, the use of Swiss franc mortgages meant that vast numbers of people lost their homes when the currency, when the markets fell and currency moved, there was currency movements against the Hungarian currency. And that gives rise to what was an outright fascist party, Jobbik, but the Fidesz steals Jobbik's clothes and becomes a far-right cultural nationalist party. And there are similar features widely across Eastern Europe. So that the Czechs aren't all the way there yet, but widely there's a lot of collapse of the liberalization which took place after 1989-91. Similarly, there's a shift into forms of constitutional government in Latin America, but the level of corruption is so severe and the level of deindustrialization and people being thrown on the scrap heap is so severe that it's not clear that there's great advantages to be obtained out of these liberalizations. This is, I suppose, the same question in a different form. Are there exceptions to the destructive trend? I want to be clear that it could be the case. It's not wholly impossible that there could be capitalism without the dynamics of the decline of the United States. It's very bloody remote possibility, because what it needs is for the United States to experience what happened to Britain in 1914 to 1945, and then the costs of the military overthrow of the power of the United States to the whole world, the military overthrow, remember, of the power of this country, which has got, I don't know how many nuclear ICBM nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. I'm not sure. In 1939, there was a widespread belief that poison gas would be used and wipe out in large-scale bombing and wipe out whole cities. But in the end, they held off because of mutual assured destruction. And so one can perhaps imagine that there could be a military overthrow of the United States without mutual assured destruction through nuclear weapons. I'm skeptical. I mean, so it seems to me there is more chance. I know it's a small bloody chance, but there is more chance of the overthrow of the US Constitution by the working class than of a shift into a more constructive form of capitalism. We talk about rather remote contingencies on both sides here. Yeah. The illusion of the Soviet Union, yes, Santucho, I can't remember what the guy's first name was a leader of the Revolutionary Workers' Party slash Popular Revolutionary Army, which was a Trotskyist organization, which went over to Castro's guerrilla project. Believe the organization still exists. Santucho is dead, but and the argument which they made was for that there was no serious prospect of bourgeois democracy in Latin America, and therefore what had to be done was the guerrilla FOCO and urban guerrilla movement. This was a very extraordinarily widespread belief in the Third World left, and it was just the Santucho group was unusual that it started as Trotskyists and went in that direction. The Posadistas also went in that direction, though about a decade earlier. Okay, Santucho argued that we had to see the Soviet Union as the rear guard, that it was possible for the workers' movement to advance, but it was necessary to see the Soviet Union as the rear guard, even though it was deformed, even though it was defective, even though it was all of these things. I don't actually think that that was the case in relation to the Mandelites. The Mandelites, if anything, did the opposite, which was that although they were formally Soviet defensist and formally for political revolution, not for the overthrow, nonetheless, actually, they took funds indirectly from US State Department sources for funding their operations in Eastern Europe. They were not careful about, they were trying to build in Eastern Europe, but they were not careful about where they were going to take funds from in order to, and resources in order to be able to do that clandestine work. And they moved the idea of political revolution away from Trotsky's idea of political revolution is essentially a coup d'etat. It's an event of the same sort as 1688 in England or 1830 in France. It's not a full-dress social revolution. It's a coup within the state. Trotsky didn't realize how many of the people he was relying on to potentially perform this operation had already been sent to the camps by the time that he was to the Gulag, by the time that he was promoting this idea, basically because his apparat, his clandestine apparat, was completely penetrated by the GPU. So that he had absolute delusion about what the state of affairs was in the Soviet Union in relation to the existence of potential opposition. So the Trotsky conception of political, but the Mandelites made that Trotsky conception of political revolution into something which was a working class social revolution in everything but name. It's so that the level of actual political difference about the question of political revolution and social revolution between the Socialist Workers' Party of the UK and the Mandelites was pretty limited. It was just that the Socialist Workers' Party insisted on calling the Soviet Union state capitalist rather than degenerated or deformed workers' state. There were guys who were, as I said, the Santucho trend, and there were people who were more rigorously defensist and relied on. So, but my sense of that, therefore, is that actually the Mandelites at one level were already disposed to unduly believe what it said in the mainstream bourgeois advertising funded media, not careful about their handling of US policy and US interventions, US affairs, and so on and so forth. I can understand why, because the Trotskyists were effectively sat on by the enormous weight of official communism from really 1942 through to 1992. Because it looked as though official communism had been enormously successful. It's only when the Soviet Union and the East European states collapsed that the question really became open. And of course, actually, most people went straight from that to neoliberalism. The bulk of the older official Communist Party was taken by the Euro-communists, and where the Euro-communists went was they became Blairites. So that, I'm not. It's true that there was a sort of hope, but the Fourth International was just as much inclined to hope. In the middle 70s, they staked everything on the coming Spanish Revolution. Then when Portugal fell into revolution and there was a cold transition in Spain, initially they refused to believe it was happening and had great difficulty in turning around this actual revolution, which was happening in Portugal. But before that, Ben Said's autobiography, they were staking an enormous amount on Latin America. They staked a lot on Argentina. In the period when Santucho, they imagined that a revolution outside of the Soviet orbit could transform the world, would be something much better than the Soviet Union. I must admit, I think quite a lot of that was just illusory, simply because, how should I put it? I don't think we could make a regime which was less repressive than the post-1689 regime in Britain, even if we didn't have the problem of, because the problem of the Soviet Union was that you did have to take sides. Because if you didn't take sides with the Soviet Union, the United States would just squash you very quickly, which is what happened to the Nicaraguans. They were half on side with the Soviet Union, but Cuba was able to, South Yemen was able to do something because they went on side with the Soviet Union. So you couldn't be not on side with the Soviet Union, but if you were on side with the Soviet Union, you were stuck with the whole apparatus of creating your own KGB and your own all of that, even if you were sort of half on side, like the Baathists in Iraq. You wind up creating your own, getting your guys, policemen and officers and so on, trained in Russia and adopting the political culture. But suppose that rather than you weren't in that situation, you did have a revolution in a largish chunk of the world. I don't think you could avoid having equivalents of the Test Act and the anti-papist laws and the all the apparatus of partial, incomplete, partial, the Riot Act 1715, and all the apparatus of incomplete, limited, partial repression, which the British state, as a revolutionary state, and it's true also of the Netherlands in the period after the during the 80 Years' War, which was started in 1568 and ran until 1648, which was the Netherlands War of Independence. So there was an element to which the Trotskyists were characterized by a delusion about how much repression would be involved in any workers' revolution. It's a comment that Marx makes against Bakunin, against authoritarianism, and Marx, in his marginal notes on Bakunin, says a revolution is the most authoritarian thing in the world. Because it's asserting the replacement of an existing terrorist authority with a new authority, and that does involve coercion. And so from that point of view, I think that the relation to the Soviet question, I'm not convinced that it's the belief in the Soviet question will come along and save us that led to these guys going over. I think if anything, it was the not thinking in a sober way about these questions and imagining a sort of, it's the utopianism. There's an element of utopianism which imagines we take power and we leap into the kingdom of freedom, which is disregarding the extent to which capitalism is a world system. That's it. That's useful to some extent, you no doubt.
Thanks very much. No, that was very useful. Let me stop